All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. It's 2 o'clock. For those of you that signed in just the last couple of minutes, if you can do me a favor and put your name in the chat box for attendance. I do have everybody muted because we are recording this, so trying to eliminate some background noise as well. So there are going to be a few points, though, during the presentation where I will pause and take questions. So if you do have questions throughout, you can use the chat box for that as well. All right, so getting started here, for those of you that have been on for a few minutes, you've probably seen the objectives and outcomes for today listed here, but just a quick overview of those before we jump right in. First of all, the objective really for today's session is to give an understanding or give the advisors an ability to gain some understanding on the placement pilot option due to the timeline of when it was rolled out. Realize not everybody had equal opportunity to access training to that before our fall enrollment period closed. And as we're getting ready to open up our spring enrollment here in a couple of weeks, I want to make sure that everybody has that opportunity. So we'll go over that pilot option as well as some of the history behind it, what the parameters are, and hopefully you can leave with some strategies for how to have this discussion with students when you're enrolling for spring. So the outcome being then that any student who is enrolling through an advisor would have then access to that basic information and walk away from an advising session knowing what their next steps would be if they chose to participate in that. So also before we just dive right in, just a little bit about the design of the training. So again, it's a webinar style, so we'll take questions at certain points throughout the session today. I want to make sure that we can get through all of the information within an hour, and I know there's several of you who have another scheduled meeting after this. So if we do have any unanswered questions within the 1 hour time frame, I'll do my best to turn those around, or I can take questions after the 1 hour session by email as well. So again, please put your name in the chat box to track attendance if you've not already done that, as well as any questions that you have as we go along, and then I'll ask Sally's help to make sure that I get all of those answered when we come to those points. And also it will be recorded, so if you do need to reference it back, or for anybody who's unable to make it today, it will be made available as a recording as well. All right, so a brief history lesson here of how we've arrived to where we are today. For some of you who are maybe newer faculty or just got the news in August that this was rolling out, it may have seemed like a surprise, but going over the history here, you'll see that it's really been a work in progress for several years. It's right now in a part 3 of a 3-phase process so far. Phase 1 being the first year when Compass announced that it was expiring or pulling its product off the market back in the summer of 2015. So that first year we identified a task force to first and foremost replace Compass, so identify a replacement platform for testing and then implement that in time for the next enrollment period. So we did that in the first year. We identified AccuPlacer and implemented that in time for the spring, for the upcoming fall enrollment. Then the next year, phase 2, we really formed a testing and placement committee with a little bit different task to start to investigate multiple measures, what that could look like for Neosho County, how we might incorporate that into a placement program for us. So that was 2016, 2017, and now we're currently in the 17-18 academic year where we've just recently adopted this pilot and putting it into practice and evaluating the multiple measures that we've chosen. So again, it's not something that was arrived at capriciously by any means, but it may seem like a surprise for some of you who are just learning of this. So what are multiple measures and why should we use them? Multiple measures essentially is anything in excess of one indicator being used for placement. Historically, it's a placement test. So for us in the past, we were using either ACT or Compass or some sort of placement test to identify and recognize where a student would be placed for their enrollment. So multiple measures could be a number of things, a number of factors that you could use to help make that placement decision. Why are we doing it? So a couple of good reasons is AccuPlacer itself does not recommend using its placement test in isolation for placement decisions. So they recommend that multiple measures are used. KBOR also recommends at least one other measure in addition to placement testing before enrolling students into developmental instruction. For us too, we did a lot of research within the committee and had a lot of discussion about different indicators and GPA as a predictive indicator. But really it goes back to the first slide here in the word cloud, where it goes back to the students being placed appropriately or accurately. So really that's our goal in mind, is to make sure that students are being placed in the correct classes. So where are we at today? The placement pilot that was adopted in August and applied retroactively to anybody for the fall enrollment period is shown here. One important note is we still have our mandatory placement policies. So for those of you that have been enrolling students with Neosho for a while, then you're familiar with that mandatory placement policy for degree-seeking students or any students planning to take a math or an English course. So that is still our policy with Neosho. The pilot is an alternative option to that, so students can opt into it if they choose. I'll go over the table down here at the bottom here in just a second, but essentially there's a two-part screening process if somebody is interested in participating in the pilot. The first is to identify, do they have high school information or GED information that's within 3 years? So if the answer is to that is yes, and it's above a 3.25 or equal to a 3.25 for their GPA, and then for their average GED score across all 4 tests, if that's a 165 or higher, then that means that within our placement pilot option, they could go directly into an English 101 or a Math 113 course without any prior testing. So no testing would be required for that student. So again, the first question is identifying whether or not a student fits that criteria. So if a student does not meet that criteria, so this could be the student is below a 325 with their high school information or GPA, or their average score across all 4 GED tests is below 165, or they could be coming in outside of that 3-year window. Any of those options could put them in bullet B there. That means that they are still required to have a placement test. So this could be AccuPlacer, this could be ACT, any of our tests that we would now accept for placement with our current policy, we could use and then apply multiple measures that the committee had come up with and approved for the pilot. So what are those measures? What you see here is an example of how we would weight placement test score for English or reading. There's also a math that we'll see here in a couple more slides. But I'll try to break this down as best I can. I'm very familiar with it myself, but I've been looking at it for about a year now. So I realize it may not be as easy to understand if it's the first time looking at it. So we'll have a chance for some questions here in a little bit. But essentially, it is broken up into 3 different categories. So a student will have their placement test weighted based on their comprehensive high school or GED information. They will also have it weighted based on their performance in specific content area. And then they will again have it weighted based on the time frame since their last completed course in that content. So again, we're on English, so we're looking specifically at English for these areas. So for each of those categories, if we start with comprehensive high school or GED evaluation, a student will either present high school transcript or a copy of their GED test scores, and then their placement score on the test that they provided will be weighted anywhere from negative 14% on that one item to a positive 14% based on their performance. So just as an example, if a student comes in with a 2.3 GPA and they had a test score, that test score would be weighted or adjusted negative 7% because of their low performance in that one area. And then you do that for each category. So you then jump down to performance and content area. Say, for instance, they had a 2.3 overall, but their English GPA was actually a 3.2. Then they would get a positive 7 in this category weighted on their placement score. Then you jump down to the third category, but notice that in this example, the scaling changes. So the spectrum could only be negative 5% to positive 5% for this particular category. Also important to notice is the fact that students who are more recently completing a course are not given a positive adjustment if that performance was poor. So you don't get a positive 5% even if you failed your class within the last year. So it's adjusted there as well. All right, so essentially students are grouped into two different methods that they could be opting into this pilot. Method one, again, is if a student has equal to or above a 3.25 high school GPA, or if they are a GED completer, if their score is a 165 or higher, averaged across all of their 4 sections of the test. Then the student can place directly into English 101 or Math 113 without any placement testing. So students who meet the criteria for method one do have to be signed off by certain individuals on either campus, and that list is provided there. And we have to mark on their registration form the specific method for tracking purposes so that we can evaluate the success of these students. So you see there's multiple individuals on each campus that are approved to do that at this point in time. All right, there's also method two. So again, if method one is not met, so a student having below a 3.25 or below a 165 average, or somebody coming in with that information that's outside of the 3-year window, could be evaluated under method two. So this means that they would still need a placement test. That placement test, if they opted in, could then be weighted on those multiple measures that we just saw. So similarly, a student would come in, have to meet initially with one of the people listed here to evaluate on method two, and then final sign-off would have to go through Sarah or Marie. And again, on this particular enrollment, it would be a paper registration form that has to be marked as method two for tracking purposes. So how does it work? I'll go through an example here so you can kind of see it in action. I will say we've had a lot of different sampling done on different students to see how it could impact placements. And this is one such scenario that we've seen. So we have a student presents AccuPlacer score of a 62. So for us, in our current cut score, if we're using our mandatory placement policy, a 62, you'll see over here on the right, places a student into intermediate algebra. It's on the lower end of that scale. So using our current policy, that student would enroll into intermediate algebra. Using the pilot, if the student is adamant about their ability to be successful in college algebra and we discuss with them the pilot option, they could have a chance to be reevaluated. So you can see also on the right over here, if that student we're placing into college algebra would require at least an 81 on the AccuPlacer. So 62 is a little ways off from 81. So let's evaluate Cliff based on his his recent performance. So he's pretty adamant that he wants evaluated under the pilot method. What we do then is we just take that 62 and we put it through the placement rubric you see here. So math is almost identical to the English and reading. It does have an extra category I'll talk about here in a second. So Cliff presents his high school information then to an advisor. His cumulative GPA does not meet method 1, so it's just below a 3.25. Let's say it's a 3.2. But his math GPA is a 3.7, and he completed pre-calculus at his high school within the last year and got a B on it. So all we're doing is we take 62 and multiply that by the first category. So he scored in the plus 7% range here based on his cumulative high school GPA. On the next category, he had a 3.7 in his math, so that falls in the plus 14%. So it's multiplied to 62. And then on the next category, he completed pre-calculus. So you notice the scale changes, but he's the highest one on that spectrum. So pre-calc gets a weight of a positive 5%. And he completed it within the last year and got an A or B. So he still gets the full 5% adjustment there. So when you add up all of those, totals 19.22, and then you add that back on to the original placement score. So this shows how this particular student could actually still score into college algebra using multiple measures. An easier way to look at that might be to just add up all of the category adjustments. So if you add 7 to 14 to 5 to 5, you get 31. So 62 times 31% gives you 19.22. So we're at a point here where you can take some questions. If you do have any questions, I don't think I've seen any in the chat box. If you do have a question, if you want to type that in, we'll see if we can address that here. All right, so Jim had a question about whether the advisor is doing the calculation that we just showed. So good question. At this point, anyone on this list would be the one performing the actual calculation. So if you're an advisor who is not currently on that list, the purpose of today is to arm you with enough information so you can discuss it with students and refer them to one of these folks to do the calculation. If it's method 1, remember there's really no need for calculation. They just need to provide evidence. So the evidence could be a high school transcript or a copy of their GED scores. At that point, it's pretty easy for any advisor to confidently say you would meet method 1. They would just need to see one of these people to complete the registration process. And I have a reminder here at the end, but I think it's a good point to mention it here too, that any advisor can complete the remaining enrollment process. The only exception being any math or English that the student is being placed via pilot. So if you have a full-time student who's going to enroll in 15 hours, you can do their 12 hours of enrollment and then have them evaluated by one of these individuals for their English enrollment specifically, if that's the case. Jen, when you get your question figured out, just let me know. The chart, it is available on T-Common. So if you go to T-Common and then the advising folder, there's a folder within there that says placement pilot materials. The charts are available on there. I'm also going to link them later in I think they're linked earlier in the slides here, and I will send this out as well afterwards. So method 1 screen again is the simplest to evaluate if a student has a 3.25 or higher in their high school GPA or has completed the GED with an average score of 165 or higher. The question about the USD, I'm not aware of that grading difference at this point in time, but I would probably defer that to outreach and would certainly be something we would have to discuss in our committee. So I don't have an answer for that at this time. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. If anybody does have any questions about anything we've already covered, go ahead and put that in the chat box and we'll try to cover it before we close here, and there will be a spot at the end where we'll take questions again. All right, for all of our advisors, again, the goal is to have enough information to be able to share this with students and let them know a little bit about the process on how they would be evaluated. There's really two different points in time when you could come into contact with a student, either before they've tested or after they've tested. Since a lot of you are probably going to be visiting with students now for the first time going into spring enrollment, they may be current students who have already taken or enrolled into their English or math courses, but you may still have some new students who are just coming in the spring, or some students in the fall who still need to take any English or math sequence courses. They would still have the option to opt in here. So if you're meeting with a student before they've tested, there's some advantages we'll talk about here in a second. But really it just starts out with asking them if they're aware or if they've heard of the pilot option for placement. So pretty simply, if it's yes, then you want to go ahead and ask them if they're interested in being evaluated using that and supplying their high school or GED information. If they are unaware of it, then you can give them the AccuPlacer info guide. It's in the TCommon folder I referenced. It's also linked here and will be sent out as well. That also, in addition to the information about AccuPlacer, it has the placement pilot option included in there, so students can read about how to schedule a test, but also how to be evaluated using the pilot method. So once you get everybody on the same page and has had a chance to look over the information, you usually get one of two pretty candid responses. They're either an emphatic yes, I want to be evaluated, or a no thanks. So if they are interested, it's really a matter at that point of making sure that they're getting all of the evidence to us so that they can be evaluated. If it's already on file, so if it's a student who has already sent us their high school transcript or their GED test scores, if you have access through EX, you would be able to look that up in org tracking, look at their high school GPA, or you can request a copy from registration for review. If it's not on file, so if they say they have not sent it yet, then you can ask for them to obtain a copy and either send it to registration or bring at least an unofficial copy in for review. The benefit here is if you have this intervention with a student before they've tested and you let them know the documentation that we need, if they can bring that to their AccuPlacer testing appointment, then the advisor or proctor that's setting them up can evaluate whether or not that, one, they even need to test if they're interested in the pilot, or two, if they have that evidence, AccuPlacer, we have it set up to where we can put that information in on the proctor side before the student starts the test, so that when they finish the test, it prints out their actual score and then their weighted score. So it saves the step that Jim was talking about, having to calculate as an advisor. It saves a step for us to have to do that with an Excel spreadsheet after the fact. So it's a little bit easier on us. It also allows us to have that conversation with them as soon as they're done testing, rather than say, okay, now let's go get some more information. So again, the advantage, if they're a method 1, is there's no testing step. If they're a method 2, then we can have AccuPlacer score it alongside their actual score so that the advisor is armed with both of those numbers. Remember too, it's a pilot that they would opt into. So, and a note that I forgot to make in a previous slide here, this scenario could go the other way. So a student could just as easily come in, score a 62, which is on the lower end of intermediate algebra range, and be adamant about their ability to be successful, but present opposite information to us and actually adjust their score down into beginning algebra. At this point, though, this is a pilot, so the students have the opportunity to opt into this or use our current placement policy. So if this were something that we were to adopt as our policy, then that could change. All right, so it's a little bit more complex if you're meeting with a student after they've tested, but a lot of times you can get more information from their response to help you kind of determine what the next steps might be. So at this point, if you're meeting with a student who has already tested, first of all, evaluate whether or not they've completed the right math or English courses that they would need. But if they do still need math or English placement, review those test scores with them and what they mean. So go over that placement. If they just walked out of the testing room, the testing results sheet has that placement information on there too, so you can easily just read that off the sheet and say, well, this suggests that you would place into intermediate algebra. So you can usually get some cues from students both ways here, whether the misplacement might be low or the misplacement might be high. Or sometimes they'll give you a cue that might indicate that it was an accurate placement to begin with. So you see some examples listed there. If the student gives you a cue that might indicate that maybe their misplacement into courses is on the low side, so maybe their appropriate placement is actually intermediate, but their score is indicating beginning, you usually get some response like, do I have to enroll into this? Or they're visibly upset about their placement score or their testing experience. At that point, you're just asking them if they feel like it's an accurate representation. If they follow up with any variation of yes, then you might just remind them that this pilot option is still available to them if they want evaluated at some point later. You might have cues, though, that might indicate that they have high misplacement, so they may be a little bit in disbelief, or if they have a response that could be flagged for excessive celebration, that might be a cue that maybe they weren't expecting that score. So on the flip side, you might ask if it's a course that they feel comfortable starting in. So following up with them, they may then give you a variation of yes or no, and you can respond accordingly there. So if you do have some cues that might indicate that they are being misplaced, that's a perfect opportunity to talk about the pilot as an option for alternative evaluation, and then go through those steps again. Request a copy of the documentation that we would need if it's not already on file, and then refer to one of the advisors that was listed previously. So one important note here, when you're visiting with a student, make no guarantees that the placement will change. One thing that we've found in a lot of the samples that we've run is that a student's score may change a couple of points in one direction, but it may actually solidify them in that range. So they may have a positive 4 or 5 point adjustment to their score, but in the case of the student that we saw a little bit ago, that may move them from a 62 to a 67, which is still an intermediate. So be careful not to guarantee that an evaluation would guarantee a change in their actual placement. It may change their score, but it might not change their placement, if that makes sense. Another thing that I think I've seen anecdotally is students who already have a really high score. When they're evaluated, it gets even higher, and students who have a really low score, looking at multiple measures, it tends to adjust it even lower. So again, in both of those cases, it often puts them more into that range that they're already in. So there's also a technique, confrontation, that you might find yourself being able to use or lending itself to you in these situations. And that's really just pointing out discrepancies in what you notice and what the student's saying or presenting when they're giving you this information. So really, this is just an inconsistency in what they're saying and maybe what their past experience has been. I can think of a specific example of a student who, right when we adopted this pilot, had just taken or completed his second attempt on AccuPlacer. Both of them put him into beginning algebra, and he was still adamant that he should be placed into at least intermediate. So I informed him about the pilot option. He was very excited to be evaluated. He said, yes, absolutely, I'm good at math, that's my strength. So he supplied his high school transcript and was negatively weighted on every single indicator for multiple measures. So at that point, it was an opportunity to say, you said that you were a strong math student. Based on your high school transcript, your math GPA would indicate otherwise. Can you explain that? So it's just an opportunity to kind of point that out to the student and give them a chance to explain it. There may be other circumstances, or sometimes they'll kind of come forth and say, okay, maybe this is more appropriate. So the ethical caution or consideration here is, as Young says, is to not bring a hammer, but to bring awareness to it. So you're not there to beat them up about it or say that they would never pass that class. It's just bringing awareness to it. All right, so a couple of important reminders. Don't forget, we have our current policy still in place in the college catalog for mandatory placement. So students would follow that and opt into this pilot program after they've been informed about it if they choose. So students can absolutely see how they would place on their mandatory placement policy, as well as get an evaluation and then choose to still go back to the current policy. So they have that option at this point in time. According to the college catalog too, there's still the ability to get exceptions through either the dean for auto and online or through the VPSL. So if somebody's operating under the current policy or is evaluated on the pilot and still is adamant about an exception, they would have to get that approved through Sarah or Marie at this point. So that's always been in place as an option for students. And then again, a final reminder that advisors not approved to enroll in Method 1 or 2 can still process the rest of their students' enrollment. So this doesn't have to stop the process of you enrolling for a program student or moving forward and securing their seat in some of their other general education courses. You can go ahead and move forward with that process and then just refer them appropriately for the English or the math, whatever it may be. So to really simplify the process, it's just a matter of informing the students at the point that makes the most sense, observing really closely how they actually respond to that. Sometimes it's easy to ignore that part or to be so much in a routine of saying the same things to students to not notice those cues, but just observe how they were responding to their placement and then referring them appropriately at that point. So kind of breaks it down a little bit more simply to remember. Are there any other questions? I don't think I saw any new ones yet, but if you have any questions about the pilot, let me know and I'll see if I can answer those. All right, I'm not seeing any questions come through. So if you do have questions after you leave, feel free to send me an email. Let me know what those are. This is something that we're evaluating throughout this academic year. So if you have questions that come up at any point, let us know, anybody on the committee know, so that we can incorporate that into our discussion and our planning. This will again be recorded, so I'll make it available to reference back, as well as send out some materials that were requested in the questions earlier. Anybody doesn't have any more questions, then that will conclude this session. If you did not sign in as you came in, please put your name in the chat. Otherwise, have a great afternoon.